Paper was like gold in medieval times.
Oh, not tobacco, sugar.
That everything we thought we knew about the world might turn out to be completely wrong.
I'm Joe Lample. When I created Growing a Greener World, I had one goal: to tell stories of everyday people, innovators, entrepreneurs, forward-thinking leaders who are all, in ways both big and small, dedicated to organic gardening and farming, lightening our footprint, conserving vital resources, protecting natural habitats, making a tangible difference for us all. They're real, they're passionate, they're all around us. They're the game changers who are literally growing a greener world and inspiring the rest of us to do the same. Growing a Greener World, it's more than a movement, it's our mission. Gardening is a year-round endeavor, but it doesn't follow a calendar with strict start and stop times. Work on this year's garden started last year, and even long before that, dating back to when I designed the garden, cleared the land, created raised beds, added fencing to enclose and protect my crops, and built the soil, making improvements and additions season after season to eventually get me to the soil I'll plant in this season. Now, before I ever put new plants in the ground, I always take time to improve the soil, and the best soil amendment for that is compost. Now, I make my own, but you can buy it. But one thing that you could use if you wanted to with your compost is a device like this that really screens it, and it's really easy to make. In fact, you don't even need instructions for this. Just get some treated wood, 2x4s work well, and some hardware cloth, and staple it to the bottom, and then screw in the sides. But this will prevent those big chunks from going into the compost as well. And it allows you to just have the ultra fine compost. Now, if you want to go super fine, actually this is ultra fine right here, is one with hardware cloth that has smaller squares. So it's a personal preference because I just let it break down naturally in the beds. But if you're inclined to want really fine compost, use a smaller square and let it sift through, and then it'll screen out these larger pieces. And even though composting is a critical step in prepping the beds for new plants, it's never really a blank slate in the garden. There are still some of last season's crops to deal with, and sometimes that means just working around them. By the way, for you savvy gardeners out there, you might have noticed that some of these plants are about to bolt. Now, this means they're past their prime, not as good as they used to be to eat, although they are still edible. But as they go to flower, that's great for my pollinator friends around here because this time of year there's not as many food choices. So by making this available, they have one more thing to eat. So I'll leave it here until I need the space. And I know I don't need the space yet because I have a master plan for all of this year's crops. That's a hugely important step in any garden because going out and buying cartloads of whatever seedlings catch your eye or randomly ordering dozens of seed packets rarely works, at least not for me. No, my best gardens always come from sitting down with pencil and paper and figuring out what's going on where, how much to plant, when to plant it, and where it's coming from. Some I may grow myself from seeds over winter, some I buy from the nursery, some are seeds obtained from faraway sources, and some come from a lot closer to home, like my neighbor Phil. Come on in.
Yes.
Got it? Great.
Yeah,
You got some chard here. These are for me, huh?
those are for you, yes.
You're a good man.
Take a look at these. Look at the roots on this plant coming out of the ground. Look at the amazing root that's there ready to go.
Oh my God. That is full, nice deep. These are going to hit the ground running.
They are going to hit the ground running.
Now when you put yours in, do you do anything with the root or do you just drop it straight in? Do you do anything to break this up?
I do a lot of of heavy spading like you're doing here,
Yeah.
and work up the soil so it's really loose, and I just set it in.
Every gardener I know has a certain method to their planting process, and that's okay. There's no one right way to go about it, and what works for you may not necessarily be someone else's cup of field peas. But along the way, we've all picked up little tips and tricks that we've incorporated into our gardening routine. And I'm about to show you one of my all-time favorites. Some people call this livestock panel. I call it a planting grid. But the fact of the matter is, it's the same thing. You get them at the tractor and farm supply stores, and they come in lengths of 16 feet. But the beauty of this, once you get it home and with a pair of bolt cutters, cut it to size for any bed, and then you have the perfect template for spacing out your seedlings. Now, I wasn't entirely sure it would work the first time it occurred to me, but one of the gardening tasks I like least is spacing out my plants in even rows and all at appropriate widths. Yes, it's important, but it can also be really tedious and extremely time-consuming. But after just a little trial and error, using these livestock panels as planting templates turned out to be one of the best ideas I've ever had. It's a huge time saver, and for a guy who's more than a little obsessive about how his garden looks, the grids are a foolproof way to achieve planting perfection. So this bed is where I'll plant my lettuce, and it's actually a great location because it gets some shade, and lettuce is one of those edibles that actually prefers some shade. Now, here's an application where I've got some plants already in the bed, and if I use a full planting grid, I would crush these plants, and I certainly don't want to do that. So the simple solution is to take a grid and cut it down into smaller pieces and just put them into place and plant into it. That way you have perfect spacing without disturbing the plants on either end. But those livestock panels are more than just one-time spacing tools. I've found several ways to make them versatile multitaskers at the garden farm. Another application of the livestock panel / planting grid that I love is to use them as trellises, and I use them for my peas all the time. I have one panel that I cut to size to fit the bed, but I also made one other modification, and that is to cut the 2 horizontal pieces from the very bottom. Now that frees these up to serve as stakes that I can push into the soil to secure the panel in the bed. It's that simple, and then I lean it slightly towards the center. Then I have another panel that matches the size exactly, and I bring that to the other side. I line them up, push it in, and it's really that easy. Now, if I wanted extra security, I could put those zip ties in here, but I never do, and they never fall apart. And now all I have to do is use these vertical slats as my planting guide, and I'll put some peas against each one. To be honest, if I had to think about how to support peas every time I wanted to grow them, twice a year in both spring and fall, I probably wouldn't even bother to plant them at all. But with the store-bought panels as my instant trellises, it takes me less than 60 seconds to prep one of my favorite crops for the entire growing season. Well, it's been exactly 4 weeks since I planted all those tiny, cool season seedlings, and everything is jumping out of the bed, like my beets and chard, and there's the broccoli and cabbage and peas. But it's no surprise. I have amazing soil and awesome homemade compost and full sun, all the conditions plants need to thrive. But now we're into mid-April. We've got the green light to plant all those classic crops of summer because there's no more risk of a late season frost. But I'm out of room. So some of these plants have to go, so I can make room for my homegrown tomatoes. So now that you have compost ready to go into your garden, the question is, how much do you use and how do you apply it? Well, here's the bad news, good news part of this story. The bad news is you can never seem to make as much as you'd like to use. Even for me at the garden farm, I always want to have more than I do, and I make a lot of compost. But the good news is, a little bit goes a long way. For example, in this bed, it's 4 feet wide and 12 feet long. And all I'm trying to do is add about 1 inch to the surface and then turn it in to about 4 to 6 inches. Now, why not more? Well, the primary roots are closer to the top, and if I worked it down even deeper, I would lose some of the benefit of that compost because it's below where those roots are, right? So if I keep it closer to the surface, that's where the roots are going to really be able to utilize it and take it up. So what I'm going to do right now is spread about 1 inch across the surface, turn it in with my fork, and then I'm ready to plant. The tomato. It's the first vegetable many gardeners plant, the only vegetable some gardeners plant, and the favorite vegetable of seemingly everybody, even though it's technically a fruit. And wherever I go around the country, the #1 topic I'm asked about from people I meet is how to get the best results when growing tomatoes. There are several methods for planting tomatoes with success. Now, most of the time, people will get their tomato plant home and put it in the ground at the level that it was growing in the container, and that is perfectly fine. But there's another school of thought, and that is to plant your tomatoes extra deep, and you can get away with it because tomatoes have these tiny white fibers on the stem. Those will become roots when they come in contact with the soil. And the thinking is, the more roots in contact with the soil, the more vigorous the plant because they can take up more water and nutrients. And the fact is, those plants do very well. Now there's a third option. If you happen to have a plant that's very tall and leggy and just won't stand up on its own, then you can plant it sideways and bury the stem. Again, those tiny white fibers will become roots, the top will turn towards the sun, and that plant will be incredibly vigorous. So we're going to try one of each and see how it goes through the season. Now the final step in the planting process with just about anything, and especially tomatoes, is to add mulch. Now, why did I say especially tomatoes? Well, they are particularly susceptible to all kinds of diseases, including some that can be transferred from the soil on up into the foliage when rain splashes and transfers that. So the mulch acts as a protective layer to prevent that from happening. So once your soil is prepared, it doesn't take long to get those tomatoes planted, watered, and mulched and ready to go. And one other important feature of the mulch, it helps to hold in that valuable moisture that these plants are going to need, especially through the hot, dry summer months. So I just planted tomatoes, my first ones, yesterday, and I have a few more beds to go. We'll have about 24 to 26 by the time it's all finished. And I'll be adding some new varieties today and next week, and then they'll go in. But it's an exciting time of year to put those little plants in the ground and to know that within 8 weeks I'll probably be harvesting fruit and the plants will be spilling over the tops of the cages, as well as everything else that's growing in this garden. The key to enjoying those first ripe off the vine tomatoes of the summer as soon as possible is to get them in the ground just after the risk of spring frost has passed. Now I plant mostly heirloom varieties. They're my favorite to eat because of the wide variety of flavors and colors. And I just love the unique story behind how each one came to be, how it was passed down through the generations because of a special trait or unusual quality that family members wanted to preserve. I spend a lot of time during my solo hours in the garden thinking about those stories. It's like therapy for me, and it makes me feel like I'm somehow in tune with those gardeners of yesteryear to know that the very same tomato I'm growing today is there because someone cared enough about that particular variety to keep it going. If you've never tried growing heirlooms, I'd encourage you to save a little room in your next garden for 1 or 2 varieties with some historical significance. You can find a list of some of my favorites on our website, as well as where to go to get them. The address is the same as our show name. It's growingagreenerworld.com. You never know, you just might find your new favorite plant. Of all the plants that I grow in my edible garden, I have to admit my favorite by far are tomatoes. Now, the one thing I don't love though is the taming of them. You know, when they get kind of big and you're trying to keep them under wraps and supported and from taking over your garden. And yes, I've tried just about every support you can possibly buy, retail and wholesale, but nothing has quite met my standards of satisfaction for how they work and how they look in the garden. That is, until now. So my aha moment came when I was thinking about other uses for those really versatile livestock panels that you get at the tractor and farm supply stores. They cost about $20 and they're 16 feet long and about 4 feet wide, but you can use them for so many things in the garden. And so I said, well, why not use them for support for my tomatoes, right? So I came up with a plan, and the plan is this. One panel makes one support, there's two pieces there, and the best part is there's no waste at all because the excess pieces that I cut away, they can go into other parts of the garden or used for other things. So here's the plan that you can make these yourself. You just need two things to make these. One livestock panel and a pair of bolt cutters that you can find at any hardware or box store. These cost me about $22 and well worth it. And go ahead and spend a few extra dollars to get the large size. It makes cutting much easier. Using livestock panels that have openings that are 6 inches apart, count across the width so that you have 6 squares and cut away the rest, all the way down the panel. With the width of the long panel now reduced to 6 squares, I count down from one end 9 squares and cut all the way across, just above the horizontal piece at the bottom of this 9th square. I then repeat that step, starting from the top of the other end of the panel. Once you cut across the piece, you now have 3 remaining pieces. The middle piece is now a nice-sized piece of fencing that can be used for a small teepee, connected to other pieces or whatever, but the size makes them very versatile in and around the garden. The 2 remaining pieces are what will make up your cage support. For each panel, cut away the horizontal pieces between the vertical pieces on the first row up from the bottom. This leaves long spikes to anchor the panels into the soil. Place each section under a piece of straight lumber, at least as long as the panel, so that 3 squares are showing against the straight edge of the lumber, and bend it up towards you until you get a 90-degree angle. Now it's simply a matter of inserting them into the garden bed around each plant, so that when both panels are installed, they form a square cage with the plant centered in the middle. A final step to make it tidy is to secure each piece together with these small cable ties. That's all there is to it. These cages are super sturdy, plenty tall enough, and just wide enough so as not to crowd the plant, but still leave ample room for other cages in the bed. At the end of the season, I'll be able to stack these in a neat pile until next time, and for many years after that. Considering all the years of use I'll get from each cage, the upfront cost of the livestock panel, I think, is a very good investment. So this is that time of year where I'm always a little bit struggling with the bittersweet aspect of it. This bed right here is full of broccoli and it's headed up beautifully, but it could stand another week or so in the ground to really get big. But I need that space for the remaining tomato plants that are still in the pots. So I'm faced with the dilemma of cutting out all of these plants and making the room. I have another bed just like this I need for peppers, so, you know, oh well, somebody's gonna be eating a lot of broccoli in the next week or so. Well, it's May 10th and I have just a few more tomatoes to plant, Craig LaHoulier's dwarf varieties. Those are going to go into a dedicated bed. along with a lot of peppers. And the earliest tomatoes went in 3 weeks ago, and that's really the most exciting time of the summer garden. When you plant those tomatoes, and then of course you get the cages in, that's the icing on the cake for me. But it's also that time where you should have the least amount of problems, because all those bad things that set into a summer garden haven't happened yet. But in my case, I've already noticed some problems. And it's called early blight, and it's brown spots on the leaves. Now, you should always inspect your plants before you bring them home to make sure that doesn't come into the garden, but a lot of times it's hard to see, and that's the case with me. It obviously got into my garden, and it started showing itself after I planted them. Gardening really is the ultimate hands-on hobby, especially when you're trying to track down the cause of a problem with one or more of your plants. A visit or even two to the garden every single day is not too often by any means, as things can often change just that quickly. Another mystery appeared early in the growing season on just 2 of my 32 tomato plants. They were showing very strange yellow foliage in the new growth only, but no other plants around them were showing similar symptoms, and the 2 affected plants were in separate beds and different varieties, so nothing in common that I could link them to. It's sometimes like playing detective, looking for clues and eliminating suspects one by one. In the case of the yellow foliage, the culprit turned out to be glyphosate. It's a common herbicide found in products like Roundup, but for an organic gardener like me, it was perhaps the most frustrating finding possible. Where could that have come from? Well, most people don't realize just how far traces of herbicide can drift once it's airborne. In my case, it apparently came from a neighboring farm. It makes sense though. They're not that far beyond the fence, and they do use that herbicide around their farm. Lucky for me, the damage wasn't severe, and my neighbor was happy to work with me ahead of future spraying. I dodged a bullet and got a good reminder of why staying vigilant in the garden is so important. At this time of the year, the most important thing is to make sure that your plants are healthy, and the main way you do that is to make sure they're hydrated. Now, we have soaker hoses and drip irrigations connected to each of these beds under all the plants. Whether you can hand water or you're gone all the time, you've got to think about what you're going to do to keep these plants well watered. In our case, those soaker hoses connected to automatic, portable drip irrigation and timers makes all the difference and takes the worry out of whether these plants get the water they need. When it comes to harvesting tomatoes, I always try to time it for the 4th of July weekend. It just seems like the perfect time. And I almost got there. I'm about a week late. So this is July 11th, but I have very healthy tomato plants. And this bed in particular, you might remember when I first planted it. The first plant went into the ground at the normal level, like it was growing in the pot. But I also demonstrated what happens when you grow it extra deep and planted it all the way up to the top 2 nodes of the plant. And it's doing fine. The third plant went in sideways, so all the roots would grow out the stem just below the surface. And it's doing fantastic, lots of tomatoes there. And this is the one I planted just in between, not too deep, not too shallow. And it's the one that has the most tomatoes ready to harvest right now. It's also shorter than the others, but that's because it has more sun exposure, it doesn't need to stretch as much, and it's been very prolific. So I'm ready to harvest and have those first tomatoes off the vine. With the first tomatoes off the vine and into the kitchen, well, that signals the unofficial halfway mark of the year in the life of the garden farm. And for us, it's a chance to reap the fruits of our labor and the sweet taste of success, literally. Now for some, this is what it's all about. It's the beginning of the end of a fast and furious growing season. Now for us, it's just a short break because we have another half year in the garden, lots of work left to do, plants to nurture, and a lot of plants that aren't even in the ground yet. But it's just part of that ongoing cycle of life in the garden. I'm Joe Lample. Thanks for joining us, everybody, and we'll see you back here next time for more Growing a Greener World.